Great, thank you. And I think you have hit upon a key passage from the book. Uh, Commentaries, there are certainly, of course, commentarial exercises in the Islamic tradition that are meant to be for readership, meaning you would sit down and you would gain information from it. And they're not necessarily trying to compel the reader to become a writer himself. And the commentaries that I look at, which are again commentaries that are found often in usul fiqh texts that are short, like the Manar, for example, or Sullam Ul-Bihari, and other similar texts, or Sakaki, for example, which is a short text on which eventually becomes a text for balagha. Those kinds of texts have embedded within them, they're written things, of course, they're texts, writerly texts or written texts. They have embedded within them a certain prehistory, which the author who's writing the commentary is aware of. And by uh, in the process of writing that particular matan or base text, the author in that process leaves certain indications for the future reader to compel the reader to write commentaries upon that very text that author had written. And then the future reader would do the same thing. They would, of course, expose and debate and critique, but in the same time, use the same kind of mechanism to advance their own argument through the voice and mouth of the next generation of writers. So in a way, there's sort of a diachronic, continuous way in which commentaries develop. At the same time, there's a kind of a textual archaeology to which the future authors are compelled. So, for example, if I'm writing my short mutton in view of a debate or set of debates that are happening in my landscape, and I don't expose all of its elements, my mutton becomes something like a launching pad for the next commentators, and I've given enough hints for them to go where they need to go behind my text. So the next commentator would actually dig text in the previous generation before me and expose them and use them at the right moments in the right way with the right kind of patchwork and connectivity to create, dispute, and advance an argument that is embedded within the main text. And in so doing, they would also recognize that the texts that they're excavating themselves are alluding to a further history, a further past. So the next generation of commentaries would exercise the same thing, the same exercise themselves in the same way. So basically, as you move forward in time, from the moment of matan is written, as you move forward in time, each new layer is going to dig further and further deeper into the past, right? So in that way, you can imagine it visually as a cycle, which is a small circle from the matan going back to the nearest past, and then the next, if time is going this way in the future, that particular commentary going back further, because now they have new mechanisms and new isharat, new indications, and then you get the next commentary on that commentary, which goes even further. So I've found often the case that the latest commentaries have access through the slow digging, have access to a much wider past, and they expose the much wider past much more than the earlier commentaries written on a tradition. Right. So that's what I mean by the cyclical return. Now, in all of this, just to finish my thought, what's happening is that, of course, a matan is a written text, but it's being debated and it's being discussed in an oral space, much like the Rampur debate, right? So the Rampur debate is something like an underlying base or underlying movement through which certain set of reports about that particular moment are printed in the Rampur newspaper called the Dabdaba Sikandari. And now that particular written form is taken up in a new oral space, in a new debate. Some of them that did not happen in Rampur, they happen elsewhere, in Kolkata, for example. And then that orality that is being put forward through that debate, of course, that orality embedded within the text itself, is now recorded again as something like a new matan, in this case, a commentary on the earlier text. And then that is debated in some other space. So the Rampur debate is effectively sort of like, you can imagine it as something like the beginning of the formation of a matan out of an oral movement. And then once it's written down in reports, then becomes the grist for the new commentarial mill in new oral debates, which do the same thing over and over again. So in one way, this is why it's an internal view of the commentaries. This is how commentarial that you see the late stage written texts are actually ultimately emerging out of these oral dialectics and then being formed as text, written text, then being written over again and so on.
Regarding the Palimpsest of Themselves, there was one thing that I was wondering. I guess it's like a two-parter. So the first is, so there's a base text, matan, right? Then there's it in the matan, it's purposely left, you can say vague, so that there are certain signposts that elicits further like responses in the form of commentaries. So the commentaries are written on the matan, like the base text, and the commentary itself is left a little, vague, and it actually, it invites other commentaries upon this commentary. So, and also this commentary becomes a matan in itself. It also becomes a base text for a further commentary. So
Yes.
we have a base text, and there's a commentary, and it invites another commentary. I was just wondering, Professor, how, like, what are the commentaries, like, what are the number of commentaries we're talking about at the end of the day? Like base text,
On the
commentary?
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, depends. The Sullam, for example, which is a short base text, you can type it out in about 30, 35 pages. And in the course of about 200 years, it had something like 100 commentaries, if I remember correctly, which also tells you how many are written. And these are just, fuller commentaries I'm alluding to. There are, of course, lexicographical notes that may be considered to be commentarial, interlinear interventions, and so on. And many that I did not really look into. So at least 100 commentaries. Again, to tell you something about how this very difficult, sophisticated text is consistently being engaged by the tradition until the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century.
Wait, Professor, when you
Um,
said 100 commentaries, sorry to ask you again, but like, is it like a commentary, like?
oh yeah, so now I'm taking the whole thing. When I say commentary, I mean could be the first order commentary on a mutton, or a second
Mhm.
order, or a third order. I'm taking the whole range of it. You might notice in the book that after a certain period, some commentaries become what I call gateway commentaries. So you won't read the mutton directly. You would only read it through that commentary if you belong in a certain tradition of argument. And so you and your group and circle would write commentaries on that commentary, but not really directly on the base text. And one
Uh,
of those commentaries then may become a gateway commentary. So,
mm,
for example, in South Asia, this is a good example right here, right? So, the one I showed you from my grandfather. Uh, in South Asia, one of the things that students are studying and engaging and commenting and pulling into the other texts and so on are these three commentaries written by Mir Zahid Harawi. He's a 17th century scholar. And Mirza Harawi, among other things, writes a commentary on Dawani's commentary on the Tahdhib al-Mantiq of Taftazani, right?
mm,
So South Asian scholars are often not, sometimes they are, I'm not going to make a universal claim, but often are not directly reading Taftazani. They're reading it through the lens of Harawi, who's reading it through the lens of Dawani. And that becomes a second order gateway commentary. And they're writing commentaries on that. So this one by Abdul Haq, for example, is, I guess, what is that, a fourth order commentary? So Abdul Haq is writing a commentary on Harawi, on Jalaluddin Dawani, on the Tahdhib of Taftazani. Right? So a bunch of people in his generation are writing on Harawi directly as a second layer commentarial window into the tradition, but not, they are, of course, also writing directly on Dawani and reading it too. It's called Mullah Jalal, but this is the kind of thing I'm trying to explain to you.
Like, Professor, the second part of the question that I want to ask was that, is there like, so in the post-classical period, so there is a, beginning, like one of the, I was watching one of your lectures where you said that, one of the way that we categorize the post-classical as the post-classical is because there is this beginning of a commentarial tradition, which is sort of which isn't happening in the classical period, I'm assuming. So I was just wondering, can we say the same thing about Islamic Maghrib, like Morocco, suppose 13th century Andalusia, and the way that scholars are writing there, like their writing style, as opposed to in the Islamic East in the post-classical period?
Yeah, so I should first begin by saying that commentary is being done in the so-called classical period too, but it's for different nature. For example, Farabi has, among other things, a famous commentary on the De Interpretatione of Aristotle, which was studied and and translated in a magisterial work by Fritz Zimmermann. It's a big fat study of the commentary of Farabi on Aristotle. So no, that is certainly happening. What is not happening, I think, in the classical period is the use of this mechanism of perpetuating internal critiques within the tradition as a future projection. So you don't have a commentary on Farabi's commentary on Aristotle. Uh, that becomes the text you study, namely Farabi. So that kind of an internal, neat, elusive mechanism that I expose in my last book, that I don't find to be, generally relevant to the classical period. So commentary is happening is of a different sort. In the post-classical period, I think it emerges the way it does because of the madrasa tradition. It is a dialectical space. You have a master and you have a student. The matan becomes just a way of beginning to have a dialogue and debate. And the matan, of course, has, as I mentioned many times, embedded within it ways to go about engaging the tradition. So that's that. You had another part to your question, which I forget. I got pulled into
so
part.
So I was talking about sort of is there like a difference between the way that scholars are writing in Islamic Maghreb, like Morocco and let's say 13th century Andalusia, and the Islamic East? Like, can we say that?
Yeah, so I have to beg ignorance on this because I really don't work on North Africa and Andalusia. You would have to go to my colleague, among others, to Khalid Al-Rawahib, he works in North Africa, among others. What I have recognized, I mean, some years ago, it might even be here, the short book that I got from Cairo on the Jumal of Khunaji, which is a strange, in my view at least, a difficult, strange, pithy logic text. I did notice that there are many commentaries on that text by people whose nisba is Tilim Sani. So again, there seems to be some kind of a regional commentarial affair taking place with reference to the Jumal of Khunaji, the 13th century important logician. But I did not track what happens there. Now, Professor Khalid Al-Rawahib knows these things inside out, so you would have to ask him. You should invite him.
Yeah, I should invite him for truth.
Muinuddin Ajmiri, who shows up in the Rampur debate, was my grandfather was the Shagird Khas of Muinuddin Ajmiri, and he took his position at the Madrasa Khaliliya in Tonk after him. So there's that continuity. So I mean, look, commentaries, just to finish this off, commentaries are repetitive. There's no doubt.
Yeah.
But there's a reason they're repetitive, and I explained that in the book.
Yeah.
Because textual excavation is demanded as part of a discursive mode. You have to go back to the old text because it's on the basis of those texts that new ideas are developing. And so the author alludes to them, and then the later commentator goes and digs into them further. So it is a kind of an embedded mechanism of commentary that they should be repetitive.
Yeah. Professor, one thing...
failure, actually.